Hello, and welcome to Mythos and Logos. For nearly 3 centuries, they marked it on every map. Cartographers in Vienna and Venice, in Amsterdam and London, rendered it in careful pen strokes and watercolour washes. They gave it rivers and mountains, boundaries and extent. Then, as if by some coordinated erasure, Tartaria vanished not from the land itself, but from human certainty. The question that has echoed across the centuries since is not, where is Tartaria, but rather something far more unsettling. How does an entire civilization disappear so completely that we eventually forget it was ever marked upon the maps at all? Tonight, we will follow the thread of this mystery backward through time, tracing how a place that seemed so real to Renaissance minds became nothing more than a footnote, an anomaly, a cartographic ghost. We will explore what scholars believe about its possible location and nature, examine the competing theories about why it vanished from official records, and consider what it means that modern minds remain so captivated by an absence. We will ask not just what Tartaria was, but why the question of it refuses to fade. May I ask for your help? Liking and subscribing takes just a moment, but makes a huge difference for the channel. I'm grateful for your consideration. I'm also always amazed by our international reach, so I'd appreciate hearing where you're joining from and your local time. And now, feel the veil between past and present growing thin as we cross into the 16th century, a time when the world seemed larger than it is today, when continents held secrets, and when a line drawn on a map could represent centuries of unknown history. The maps don't match. If you travel to the great libraries of the world today, to Vienna, to the Houghton Library at Harvard, to the British Library in London, you can hold in your hands copies of maps that predate your modern world by half a millennium. These are not crude speculative drawings. They are careful, professional productions created by master cartographers who had earned their reputation through precision and trustworthiness. You can see the delicate hatching that indicates forests. You can trace the thin lines that represent rivers and trade routes. You can read the place names written in careful script, some in Latin, some in Dutch or German, some in Cyrillic characters unfamiliar to Western eyes. And there, in the space between Europe and Asia, in the region north of the Caspian Sea, and stretching eastward across the Central Asian steppes, you will find a name repeated across decades of maps: Tartaria. It appears on the map of the world created by Gerard Mercator, the Flemish cartographer, whose projection system still shapes how we visualize our planet. It appears on Dutch maps from the Amsterdam School of Cartography, those brilliant producers of atlases who dominated the map market of the 17th century. It appears on maps made in the German-speaking territories, on Italian maps, on Portuguese maps, created in an age when maritime powers competed not just for territory, but for the authority to define the world. The cartographers were not guessing. They were not inventing from pure imagination. They were responding to reports fragmentary, sometimes contradictory, but persistent reports of a vast region inhabited by peoples organized into some form of political structure, distinct enough to merit a single name on the map. Yet here is the peculiar puzzle that has drawn scholars and amateur historians alike into decades of speculation. If Tartaria was real enough to appear on these maps with such consistency, why does it not appear in the historical records that preceded these cartographic representations? Why is it absent from the detailed chronicles of the Persian writers who documented the peoples of Central Asia? Why do the Russian chronicles, which recorded so much detail about their frontier regions, say nothing of an organized empire called Tartaria? And perhaps most mysteriously of all, why did Tartaria vanish from maps as suddenly as it had appeared? By the 19th century, the name had nearly disappeared from European cartography, replaced by more specific regional designations and a creeping accuracy born of increased exploration and scientific measurement. The maps do not match the historical records. The records do not mention what the maps insisted was real, and neither maps nor records offer a satisfying explanation for why this mismatch exists at all. This is the beginning of our mystery, the first thread in a tapestry that has fascinated and frustrated historians. For generations, not a tapestry of certain facts, but a tapestry woven from absence, from gaps, from the space between what seems documented and what remains utterly unknown. When empires fade from memory, before we explore the specific mystery of Tartaria, we must understand something fundamental about how civilizations disappear from human consciousness. It is not an uncommon occurrence. The world is littered with forgotten empires, with lost capitals, with peoples who built great things and then slipped from the record entirely. Some were conquered so thoroughly that their conquerors' stories became the only stories told. Some were overwhelmed by larger historical currents that swept their achievements aside. Some simply faded over generations as the languages they spoke died and the traditions they maintained transformed into something else entirely. The Sumerians were the inventors of writing, and yet for millennia, European scholars knew nothing of them. The great cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa in the Indus Valley were built by a civilization whose script remains partially undeciphered, whose political organization and daily life we can only glimpse through archaeology, because their own written records do not speak to us clearly. The Nabatean kingdom, which controlled crucial trade routes across the Arabian desert, created cities and maintained a sophisticated economy, and then vanished so completely from European memory that when Johann Ludwig Burckhardt rediscovered the city of Petra in 1812, he found a place that centuries of European scholars had entirely forgotten. Forgetting happens regularly, but Tartaria presents a different puzzle entirely because it was not forgotten by the world. Before living memory, it was forgotten while still being marked upon maps. It did not fade into invisibility over the span of centuries. It was erased from the cartographic record even as the age of exploration was advancing geographical knowledge. This is not the gradual fading of ancient memory. This is something far more deliberate and far more strange. The question that began it all. The historians and cartographers who first noticed the Tartaria problem posed their question carefully, almost uncertainly, as though they were not quite certain they had identified something worth investigating at all. It emerged gradually from scholarly comparison, the kind of patient, meticulous work that leads to eureka moments only after months or years of careful notation. Someone would be examining maps from the 17th century and notice the consistency with which a particular region appeared. Someone else would search the historical records of the same period and find no corresponding mention. Others would begin to gather references, comparing cartographic notations across different makers and different regions, building a catalogue of what the maps claimed and what the histories denied. By the 19th and 20th centuries, this cataloguing work had become systematic enough that scholars could identify the core paradox with clarity. Here was a named territory that appeared on maps with sufficient consistency that it could not be a simple error, yet here was an absence of corresponding historical documentation that seemed equally impossible to dismiss. The territory was large, vast, even the maps gave it rivers and mountains, placed it north of the Caspian Sea, and extending across the steppes of Central Asia. The maps agreed on its general location, even when they differed on specifics. Multiple independent cartographers, working in different cities and different countries, all included Tartaria on their representations of the world. The central question crystallized. If Tartaria existed, even partially, why was there no one writing about it? And if it did not exist, why were so many careful, professional cartographers insisting that it did? This is the question that will guide our entire journey tonight. This is the thread that leads backward through time, to the moment when Tartaria first appeared on maps, and forward to our contemporary moment, where the mystery has never been entirely resolved. It is a question that touches on fundamental issues: how we know what we know, how information travels across cultures and centuries, how empires can be remembered and forgotten nearly simultaneously, and how a simple gap in the historical record can captivate minds for generations. You stand in the archives. Imagine yourself in that space, where time seems to move differently. The light falls in pale rectangles through tall windows, filtered and softened by the dust that floats in the still air. You are standing in the archive of a great library, perhaps Vienna, perhaps Amsterdam, perhaps London. The temperature is carefully controlled to preserve these documents. The humidity is monitored. The light is gentle, almost tomb-like in its quietness. Your footsteps are muted on the floor, and you move slowly, reverently, as one does in such places. Before you, on a table specially designed to hold delicate materials, rests a map. It is large enough that you must shift your weight from side to side to take it all in. The paper is thick, aged to a deep cream colour, with small marks and tears at the edges that speak of 3.5 centuries of handling. You can smell it, that distinctive scent of old paper, slightly musty, with undertones of the materials used to create the ink and wash the colours. A skilled conservator has prepared it for viewing. You do not touch it directly. Instead, your eyes follow the lines as closely as fingertips might explore terrain. There are the recognizable features: the Black Sea, rendered as a dark blue shape, the Mediterranean, extending westward. You can orient yourself through these familiar anchors. Your eye moves eastward, searching, and there marked clearly, given its own space on the map, rendered with as much detail as regions that truly existed in the historical record, is the label written in careful Latin script, Tartaria. The cartographer has given it rivers. You can trace them flowing downward from mountains, indicated by careful parallel lines. There are notations suggesting settlements, small circles that might represent cities or important trading posts. The region is given substance, given reality through the act of representation. It is not sketched uncertainly, as if the mapmaker were guessing. It is rendered with the same precision as the region directly to the west or the one to the south. It is, for all intents and purposes, mapped as real as any other territory. You stand there in the quiet of the archive, in the carefully preserved light of centuries, and feel the peculiarity of the moment. Before you is evidence of something that should not be. You are looking at history in the act of making a claim, and simultaneously, you know that claim would be lost, forgotten, erased from the consensus of what the world contained. You are looking at an absence that somehow, paradoxically, has been carefully preserved. The map in front of you is a document of mystery itself. The cartographer's whispers. To understand how Tartaria came to exist on maps, we must travel backward to a moment when Europe was undergoing a profound transformation in how it understood geography. The Renaissance brought with it a hunger to map, to codify, to represent the world in increasingly precise and beautiful ways. Printing had been invented. The techniques for reproducing maps had advanced. Suddenly, it was possible to create multiple copies of the same map, to distribute them across Europe, to build upon previous mapmakers' work in ways that had never before been possible. Maps became commodities. They became prestige items. They became tools of both knowledge and power. The mapmakers themselves occupied a peculiar position in society. They were not merely technicians or copyists. The great cartographers of the 16th and 17th centuries were treated as authorities on the nature of the world. When Gerard Mercator created his projection, he was solving not just a mathematical problem, but a philosophical one. How do you represent a sphere on a flat surface without sacrificing too much accuracy? The solutions cartographers developed became so influential that they shaped how entire generations visualized the world. If something appeared on a Mercator map, it carried a weight of authority. If multiple cartographers included the same feature, it suggested that the feature was real enough that knowledgeable people had decided to represent it. Yet the strange thing about Tartaria's appearance on maps is that it seems to have arrived not from systematic exploration or verified reports, but rather through a kind of cartographic inheritance. It appears that once one respected mapmaker included it on a map, other mapmakers copied it, the name spread, it became established. It was perpetuated not because each successive cartographer had verified its existence independently, but because the previous mapmaker had included it, and the work of previous mapmakers was treated as foundational knowledge upon which new maps could be built. Maps begat maps. The representation, once established, became self-perpetuating. This creates a curious historical situation. Tartaria appears on maps, not necessarily because it was known to exist, but because the process of map-making, which involves building upon previous cartographic work, created a kind of momentum. A territory that had been included on one map would be included on the next, slightly adjusted based on new information, positioned slightly differently based on the new map's projection, but fundamentally still there. The assumption of existence became embodied in the maps themselves. Future cartographers, seeing Tartaria on previous maps, would include it on their own, not from independent verification, but from the reasonable assumption that if multiple respected cartographers had included it, it must be real. Yet something else was happening simultaneously. As exploration increased, as more detailed knowledge of Central Asia began to reach Europe through trade routes and diplomatic missions, as the actual geography of the region became clearer, Tartaria began to seem less necessary. More specific names emerged. The Kyrgyz peoples were mentioned. The Kazakh lands became better documented. The Mongol successor states were better understood. As the world became less mysterious, as the blank spaces on maps were gradually filled in with verified information, Tartaria seemed to fade backward into the cartographic shadows, less like a discovered place, and more like a vestigial remnant of an earlier, more uncertain geography. What we see, then, is not the history of a place, but the history of how information and misinformation travels through systems of knowledge. Tartaria appeared on maps because someone believed it existed or had encountered references to it in sources now lost to us. It persisted on maps because the nature of cartographic work involves building on what came before, and it disappeared from maps not because it was discovered to be false, but because it became obsolete, superseded by more detailed and verified geographic knowledge. East of Europe, west of mystery. If Tartaria existed, where would it have been? This question has generated decades of scholarly speculation, cartographic analysis, and competing theories. The maps themselves provide some guidance. Most cartographers place Tartaria in a vast region stretching north of the Caspian Sea, across the Central Asian steppes, extending eastward toward Siberia, and westward toward the lands of the Scythians and earlier nomadic peoples. It was, in other words, placed in one of the least explored, least accessible regions that Europe knew anything about, a region whose geography was understood primarily through fragmentary reports from traders, through tales told by travellers, through references in historical sources from cultures that were themselves distant and not entirely reliable in the eyes of Renaissance scholars. The region itself is formidable. The steppes of Central Asia are vast beyond easy comprehension, an expanse of grassland and semi-arid terrain that extends for thousands of miles. It is a landscape that challenges empires. It is a landscape of horses and herds, of peoples who moved seasonally following grazing lands and water sources. It is a landscape where cities, if they existed, would need to be positioned carefully near rivers or other permanent water sources. It is a landscape where political organization would need to be adapted to the realities of nomadic or semi-nomadic life. Several theories emerged about where Tartaria might have been positioned within this vast region. Some scholars, examining the maps closely, suggested that Tartaria corresponded to the region north of the Caspian Sea in what is now Kazakhstan and southern Russia. This location would place it adjacent to known historical peoples and empires. It would place it along trade routes. It would position it in a region that was known to be inhabited by various peoples, but whose political organization and history were not well understood by Europeans. Other theories proposed that Tartaria might have referred to a more expansive region, encompassing much of the Central Asian steppes. In this interpretation, Tartaria was not the name of a specific, unified empire, but rather a general European term for the vast steppe region and whatever peoples inhabited it. The term might have been derived from the Greek reference to Tartarus, the underworld, the place below, but applied by later mapmakers to the vast unknown lands to the east. The name would have carried connotations of the foreign, the distant, the scarcely comprehensible. Still other theories, developed in more recent decades, have proposed that Tartaria might have been a reference to the Tatar peoples who inhabited Central Asian regions, with European cartographers gradually transforming the name from Tartar to Tartaria through processes of linguistic adaptation and perhaps deliberate renaming. In this interpretation, Tartaria would not be an unknown empire at all, but rather a European effort to give a unified name to peoples and territories that were, in reality, quite diverse and politically fragmented. What unites all these theories is recognition that the mapmakers were working with incomplete information, fragmentary reports, and the challenge of representing vast, distant, and incompletely known territories. They were doing the best they could with what they knew. In the process, they created a category, Tartaria, that allowed them to represent and organize their incomplete knowledge. Whether Tartaria was real, or whether it was simply a useful fiction for organizing what Europeans did not fully understand about the eastern steppes, remains one of the central questions that keeps the mystery alive. The empire that might have been. If we accept that Tartaria was represented on maps as a significant territory, what might we say about what the mapmakers believed it to be? The way territories are represented on historical maps often tells us as much about what mapmakers assumed as it does about verified geography. Tartaria, in the maps that include it, is represented not as a vast, undifferentiated wilderness, but as an organized territory with internal structure. There are rivers marked, there are regions delineated, there are notations that suggest settlements and important locations. From these representations, from the fragmentary historical references that might relate to the region, and from what we know of other peoples who inhabited Central Asia during the periods when Tartaria appeared on European maps, we can construct a speculative picture of what an organized Tartaria might have resembled. It would have been, most likely, a civilization adapted to steppe life. Its economy would have been based primarily on pastoral herding horses, sheep, possibly yaks or other creatures suited to the terrain. Trade would have been crucial, as steppe peoples have historically positioned themselves as middlemen between the settled agricultural civilizations to the south and east and the forests to the north. If Tartaria existed as an organized state or confederation, it would have needed to maintain control over crucial trade routes. The Silk Road, that vast network of routes connecting China to Europe, ran through or near the Central Asian regions where Tartaria would have been located. Control of trade routes meant wealth. It meant the ability to tax merchants, to grow prosperous, to accumulate resources. It meant the possibility of supporting a class of rulers, administrators, and warriors, the infrastructure of empire. The military organization of such an empire would have been based, almost certainly, on mounted cavalry. The horse peoples of the steppes developed tactical innovations that made them formidable warriors, capable of projecting power across vast distances far more rapidly than sedentary societies could manage. An organized Tartarian empire would have possessed, presumably, a sophisticated cavalry force skilled horsemen trained to fight from horseback with bow and sword. Such forces had proven, repeatedly throughout history, capable of defeating much larger, supposedly more advanced armies. The cultural and religious life of Tartaria, in whatever form it took, would have been influenced by the peoples and traditions of Central Asia. The region had been touched by various religious movements: Zoroastrianism from Persia, Buddhism from the Indian subcontinent, Islam from Arab expansion, shamanism from indigenous traditions. Any organized state in the region would have had to navigate these various influences, synthesizing them into a coherent system that could bind its people together. Yet here is where speculation must encounter its limits. We do not know if Tartaria existed. We do not know what it believed, how it organized itself, what values motivated its people. We know only that European cartographers believed it was significant enough to mark on their maps. We know that something existed in the minds of mapmakers, even if we cannot be certain that the something corresponded to any reality on the ground. A moment of certainty, consider a specific moment, preserved now only in the maps themselves. The year is 1569. The place is a workshop in Duisburg, in the Rhineland, where a man named Gerard Mercator sits at his work. Mercator is not young, he is in his late 50s, still decades from death, still producing the work that will secure his immortal fame. Before him lies a copper plate, soon to be engraved with the lines and notations that will become one of the most famous maps in history. Mercator is a man of learning, a scholar as much as a technician. He has studied ancient sources. He has incorporated reports from traders and explorers. He has attempted to synthesize the geographic knowledge of his age into a unified representation. He holds in mind, as he works, a sense of where things are. The Mediterranean is familiar. The Atlantic coast of Europe is well known. But to the east, the knowledge becomes more fragmentary, more dependent on reports and references, more subject to interpretation and educated guessing. As Mercator marks the copper plate, rendering his vision of the world that will soon be printed and distributed across Europe, he marks Tartaria. He gives it location. He gives it extent. He commits it to representation. Whether Mercator knew from his own research that Tartaria existed, or whether he was simply accepting it as established knowledge from previous mapmakers, we cannot say. The moment itself is lost. But the result is that one of the most respected and influential cartographers of the age has included Tartaria on his map. Other mapmakers will see it. They will incorporate it into their own work. The representation will spread. This is the moment when Tartaria becomes cartographically established, not because its existence has been verified, but because a trusted authority has represented it. This is how knowledge works sometimes, not through careful verification, but through the inheritance of accepted facts. The map that Mercator creates will be copied, modified, elaborated upon. Tartaria will appear again and again in the cartographic record, and no one will be entirely certain why. The roads and cities. Imagine the landscape that these maps were attempting to represent. The steppes of Central Asia stretch endlessly beneath an enormous sky. In spring, the grasslands come alive with new growth. Animals graze across the plains. Rivers flow toward distant seas. The summers are hot and dry. The winters are brutal. Temperatures drop far below freezing. Snow sweeps across the landscape with devastating force, and survival itself becomes a daily struggle. Yet even in such a landscape, human civilization can take root. Cities can be built, roads can be established, trade can flourish. The history of Central Asia is a history of peoples who adapted brilliantly to steppe conditions, who created sophisticated societies, who built trading networks, and established empires that shaped world history. If Tartaria existed as a real civilization, its cities would have been positioned carefully. They would have been located near rivers, the Volga, the Ural, the Ili, or other water sources. A city without access to reliable water in the steppe is a city doomed to fail. The mapmakers who included cities on their representations of Tartaria understood this basic principle of geography. They showed rivers, they showed settlements along those rivers. They showed the logic of settlement patterns adapted to the landscape. The roads connecting these cities would have followed certain necessities. They would have traced routes where water was available. They would have connected important trading centres. They would have facilitated communication across the vast distances of the steppe. Such roads would have been more conceptual than physical, not paved highways, as in Roman territories, but rather established routes that merchants knew to follow, pathways worn into the earth by the passage of countless caravans and armies. These roads would have intersected with the greater trade networks of Eurasia. Goods from China would have moved westward along such routes. Goods from Persia and the Middle East would have moved northward. Goods from Europe would have reached eastward. The merchants who moved along these roads would have carried not just goods, but also information, stories, reports, news of distant lands. If Tartaria was positioned along these routes, it would have been a place where information converged, where cultures met, where different worldviews encountered one another. We can imagine the bustle of such cities if they existed. We can imagine merchants setting up their goods in markets. We can imagine administrators collecting taxes on goods passing through. We can imagine scholars and priests and warriors and common labourers moving through the streets. We can imagine the sounds of different languages, the smells of strange foods, the visual impression of people from distant lands dressed in unfamiliar clothing. We can construct this image in our minds, even though we cannot be certain that the reality existed at all. Where water flows, the geography beneath. To truly understand where Tartaria might have existed, we must look closely at the geography of the region where maps placed it. The Central Asian steppes are not a uniform landscape. They are broken by mountains, by river valleys, by regions of more and less habitable terrain. The Caspian Sea stands as a major geographical feature, one of the largest bodies of water in the world, a barrier and a highway, a source of fish, and a connection to distant regions. North of the Caspian lie the steppes that extend northward into what is now southern Russia. East of the Caspian lie the vast expanses of present-day Kazakhstan. The Ural Mountains mark a boundary, separating European Russia from Asian steppes. The Altai Mountains to the east create a region of greater topographical complexity. Rivers are the lifelines of this vast landscape. The Volga River, Europe's longest river, flows southward from its source, north of Moscow, eventually reaching the Caspian Sea. The Ural River marks a traditional boundary between Europe and Asia. The Sir Daria and Amu Daria rivers flow through Central Asia, reaching toward the Aral Sea. The Ili River flows through what is now Kazakhstan. These rivers create corridors of habitable land cutting through the steppes. They provide water for drinking and for animals. They offer fish as a food source. They enable agriculture in their valleys. They form natural highways for trade and travel. If Tartaria was positioned in this region, it would have been a vast territory that encompassed multiple river valleys and the steppes connecting them. An organised state controlling such a territory would have possessed considerable power. It would have been able to levy taxes on merchants using its routes. It would have controlled valuable resources. It would have been able to field armies capable of defending itself against rivals. The geography itself would have suggested a natural political unity. These river valleys and steppes formed a distinct region, distinguishable from the lands to the south where different civilizations flourished, different from the forested regions to the north, different from the territories further east. Modern exploration and cartography have revealed the geography of the region in precise detail. We now know the exact locations of mountains and rivers, the climate patterns, the soil types, the vegetation patterns. What we have learned through scientific investigation is that the region where maps placed Tartaria is indeed capable of supporting human civilization. It supported many civilizations throughout history. The Scythians inhabited regions in the south. Various Turkic peoples moved through the steppes. The Mongol empires emerged from and controlled these territories. The region was never empty, never uninhabited. Whether it was ever unified under a single name and authority called Tartaria remains the unanswered question. The climate of the region is harsh. The summers are short but intense. The winters are long and severe. Animals must be hardy. People must adapt to extremes. The landscape selects for toughness, for resilience, for the ability to survive with minimal resources. Yet humans have always found ways to survive in such places. They have built cultures adapted to the conditions. They have created beauty and meaning, even in harsh environments. If Tartaria existed, its people would have been such people adapted to the steppe, hardened by the environment, skilled in the arts of survival, the people of the steppes, who might have been the people that Europeans called Tartarians. This question leads us into the complex and fascinating history of Central Asian peoples. The region has been home, throughout history, to various groups: the Scythians, with their distinctive gold work and their mastery of the horse; the Sarmatians who followed; various Turkic peoples, including the Tartars, from whom the name Tartaria might have been derived; the ancestors of the Kyrgyz and Kazakh peoples who inhabit the region today. At different times in history, different groups dominated, empires rose and fell, migrations moved peoples across vast distances. One possibility that some scholars have proposed is that Tartaria was a European attempt to give a unified name to the various Tartar peoples. The Tartars were a significant group in Central Asia, inhabiting regions that correspond roughly to where maps place Tartaria. As European knowledge of the Tartars increased, as more information about them reached the West through various channels, mapmakers might have decided to create a unified designation. Tartaria would thus be not the name of a specific empire, but rather a European category for a collection of related peoples occupying a vast region. The peoples of the steppes, historically, have been known for several characteristic features. They were excellent horsemen, developing sophisticated cavalry tactics that made them formidable warriors. They were skilled craftspeople, creating beautiful weapons, tools, and decorative objects. They were traders, positioning themselves as crucial middlemen in long-distance commerce. They were, in many cases, organized into confederations and tribal groups, rather than centralized empires, though from time to time, powerful leaders would arise, who could unite larger populations under their authority. The culture of steppe peoples was typically centered on the horse. Horses provided transportation, served as tools of war, offered a measure of wealth, and played a role in religious and ceremonial life. The ability to ride well, to fight from horseback, to understand and care for horses, these skills were fundamental to a warrior's identity. A society based on horses was a society capable of rapid movement, of pursuing enemies across vast distances, of projecting power across the landscape far more effectively than sedentary societies could manage. If Tartaria existed as an organized society, it would likely have shared these characteristic features of steppe civilization. Its wealth would have been based partly on pastoral herding and partly on control of trade. Its military power would have derived from skilled cavalry forces. Its culture would have reflected adaptation to the landscape and the values of peoples whose lives were centered on horses and the open terrain of the steppes. Its religious beliefs might have incorporated shamanism, with specialists who could commune with spiritual forces and interpret the will of the spirits to guide the community's decisions. The role of women in steppe societies was often different from that in sedentary, agricultural civilizations. Archaeological evidence and historical accounts both suggest that women in many steppe societies enjoyed more freedom and authority than was typical in contemporary Europe. Or Asia Minor. Women could own property, could participate in economic life, could even, in some cases, hold positions of political authority. If Tartaria existed, its women might have played roles in society that would have seemed shocking to contemporary European observers. The weight of silence. Yet for all the speculation, for all the ways we might imagine what Tartaria could have been, there remains the fundamental problem, the silence of the historical record. If Tartaria was a significant empire or confederation, why do the historical documents of the period say nothing about it? This silence is not a small gap. It is a vast absence. The chroniclers of Persia, writing detailed accounts of the peoples and lands they encountered, do not mention Tartaria. The Russian chronicles, which document the struggles and interactions of Russian principalities with their neighbours, do not speak of an organized Tartaria. The Chinese sources, though focused primarily on China and its immediate neighbours, do not record an empire called Tartaria that they encountered. The silence extends to archaeological evidence. We have excavated sites from Central Asia that provide evidence of sophisticated civilizations, of organized states, of important trading centers. Yet nowhere in this archaeological record do we find clear evidence of a civilization that called itself Tartaria, or that matches the descriptions that would fit the maps' representation of Tartaria. We find evidence of the peoples who inhabited the region, the Scythians, the Sogdians, the Turks, the Mongols. We do not find the smoking gun that would prove Tartaria was real. This silence is troubling to anyone who wishes to assert that Tartaria was a real civilization. It raises the question, how could an organized empire appear on maps with such consistency and yet leave no trace in the historical sources of the period? How could something be important enough to map repeatedly, yet be invisible to chroniclers and historians who are actively recording the events of the era? Several possibilities present themselves. One is that Tartaria never existed at all, that it was a fiction, a mapmaker's error that persisted through subsequent copying. Another is that Tartaria existed, but was so poorly documented by contemporary sources that no clear trace remains. A third is that Tartaria is the name European mapmakers gave to a collection of peoples and territories that had their own names, their own political organizations, but whom Europeans did not fully understand, and thus lumped together under a single designation. A fourth is that records about Tartaria once existed but have been lost, leaving us with maps but without the documentation those maps were based on. Whatever the explanation, the silence creates a peculiar condition. Tartaria exists in maps, but not in historical records. It exists as a representation, but not as a documented reality. It is present as an absence, real as a cartographic claim, but ghost-like when we attempt to substantiate it through other forms of evidence. This silence, in many ways, is what makes Tartaria so fascinating to modern minds. The mystery is not solved. The explanation is not clear. We are left with a puzzle that resists easy resolution. You walk through empty streets. Picture yourself in a city that may never have existed. The sun is high overhead, beating down on the streets. The air is dry and hot, the heat of the steppe when summer is at its height. Around you stand buildings made of stone and brick, constructed with the practical efficiency of people who understand how to build in such a climate. The architecture reflects an adaptation to the landscape. Thick walls to provide insulation from heat and cold. Small windows positioned to catch breezes while minimizing heat gain. Courtyards that create pockets of relative coolness. The city is silent. Your footsteps echo on the paved streets. You see no one. The buildings, though standing, seem empty. Doorways open onto darkness. Windows are blank, watching nothing. This is a city frozen in time, or perhaps a city that was never quite alive at all, existing only in the intention of mapmakers and the imaginations of those who studied their work. You move deeper into the city. searching for signs of life. Perhaps you find a market square, with stone platforms where merchants might once have arranged their goods. Perhaps you discover what might have been an administrative building, larger than the others, positioned centrally, suggesting the seat of authority. Perhaps you see defensive walls surrounding the city, indicating that whoever built this place understood they needed to protect themselves against enemies. All of these things might be here, or perhaps they are not. You cannot be certain. The silence is absolute. There is no sound of voices, no sound of animals, no sound of commerce and daily life. There is only the wind, moving across the empty city, carrying dust through streets that no feet have walked for centuries, or perhaps for no feet at all. You listen, and in the silence, you hear the question posed by Tartaria itself. Did this place ever truly exist? Are you walking through the ruins of a forgotten empire? Or are you wandering through a phantom city, a place that existed only in the minds of men working at drafting tables in distant European cities? The buildings around you seem to contain history, though they offer none. They seem to promise revelation, though they reveal nothing. You are suspended in uncertainty, standing in a place that might have been real or might have been entirely imaginary. The city does not answer. It simply stands, empty and questioning, a monument to a mystery that refuses to resolve. The erasure begins. As the 16th century gave way to the 17th, something began to shift in European representations of Central Asia. It was not a sudden change. Maps did not transform overnight, from including Tartaria to excluding it. Rather, it was a gradual process of refinement, of increasing specificity, of replacing broad categories with more precise geographical designations. As European knowledge of the region improved through increased trade, through diplomatic missions, through explorers venturing into the steppes and returning with more detailed reports, the need for a catch-all category, like Tartaria, began to diminish. More specific names began to appear on maps with increasing frequency. The Kyrgyz peoples were mapped with greater clarity. The Kazakh territories were marked out with more precision. The various khanates that ruled the region were identified and located. Russian expansion eastward from Moscow provided European sources with more direct information about the regions immediately to the east of Christian Europe. Chinese sources, becoming more accessible as Europe's knowledge of Asia grew, provided information about Central Asian regions from an Asian perspective. The gradual replacement of Tartaria with more specific designations was not really a scientific discovery that Tartaria did not exist. Rather, it was a refining of geographical understanding. Where Tartaria had been a vague and catch-all category for vast territories that Europeans did not fully understand, new maps began to break that vast region down into smaller, named territories. The category became unnecessary. The specific became possible. What is fascinating is that this transformation happened without any great fanfare. There was no moment where a scholar stood up and declared that Tartaria was a mistake and must be removed from all future maps. There was no conference of cartographers convening to decide to exclude Tartaria. Instead, mapmakers simply, gradually, stopped including it. As they learned more about the region, as they received better information, as the process of geographical knowledge accumulation continued, Tartaria faded away. It was not disproven. It was not debunked. It was simply superseded. By the late 18th century, Tartaria had nearly disappeared from European maps. Where it had once appeared with consistency, now it was rare to find it at all. The name itself seemed increasingly quaint, increasingly a relic of an earlier age. As European mapmaking became more scientific, more systematic, more based on actual exploration and measurement, rather than on inherited cartographic tradition, Tartaria ceased to fit. It became a reminder of an earlier, less precise age of mapmaking. 4 explanations for a missing empire. Over the centuries that have passed since Tartaria's disappearance from maps, scholars have proposed various explanations for the mystery. These theories represent different approaches to the problem, different ways of trying to make sense of the gap between the maps that included Tartaria and the historical record that did not. The first explanation, favoured by many scholars, is that Tartaria was essentially a cartographic error or catch-all category that accumulated over time. In this interpretation, early mapmakers, faced with vast territories they did not fully understand, created Tartaria as a placeholder. Subsequent mapmakers, respecting the work of their predecessors, perpetuated the category without truly knowing whether it corresponded to a real, unified territory. The name might have been derived from references to Tartars or other peoples, but it was inflated into a continental designation that never had a real political referent. As geographical knowledge improved and mapmakers began breaking down the vast unknown into more specific categories, Tartaria became obsolete. This explanation has the virtue of accounting for why Tartaria could appear on maps without appearing in historical records. It was never based on systematic knowledge of an actual empire, but rather on inherited cartographic convention. The second explanation proposes that Tartaria was indeed a real political entity, but one that was so poorly documented in surviving sources that it has left minimal traces. Perhaps Tartaria was a confederation of tribes, loosely organized, and without the kind of centralized administration that leaves extensive written records. Perhaps it was a short-lived empire that rose and fell before leaving much historical documentation behind. Perhaps the peoples of Tartaria had a writing system that has not survived, or records that were created on perishable materials that did not endure. In this interpretation, Tartaria was real, but the historical record simply has not preserved the evidence of its existence in forms that modern scholars can access. The third explanation emphasizes the possibility that Tartaria represents multiple entities that European mapmakers unified under a single designation. In this view, Tartaria might have been the European name for a collection of steppe peoples, the Tartars, the Kyrgyz, various Turkic groups who inhabited a vast region but who were not politically united under a single authority. European mapmakers, unfamiliar with the complex political organization of the region, simplified it by giving the entire territory a single name. As European knowledge of the region improved, mapmakers began to recognize that this vast territory was not unified and began to replace Tartaria with more specific designations that reflected the actual political realities of the region. The fourth explanation is more speculative, but has gained some attention in recent decades. It proposes that Tartaria might have been intentionally removed from maps that, as European powers established their own interests in Central Asia, as colonialism and imperial expansion became driving forces in European politics, Tartaria was deliberately suppressed from cartographic representations. In this interpretation, Tartaria might have represented either an indigenous civilization that colonial powers wished to deny or erase from history, or alternatively, it might have represented a Russian interest that other European powers wished to deny or minimize. The explanation requires positing a kind of conspiracy, a deliberate removal of Tartaria from maps for political reasons. While it has supporters among those fascinated by Tartaria, it lacks strong supporting evidence and requires accepting that historical actors are engaged in deliberate suppression of geographical information. Each of these explanations illuminates different aspects of the Tartaria mystery. Each offers a possible resolution to the puzzle, yet none of them is entirely satisfying. Each leaves questions unanswered. Perhaps the truth involves elements of all of them. Perhaps Tartaria was partly a catch-all category, partly a reference to real peoples with unclear political organization, and partly a victim of historical processes that gradually replaced it with more specific information. Perhaps, in other words, The mystery of Tartaria is not a mystery that can be entirely solved, but rather one that will continue to generate questions and speculation for as long as people remain interested in how empires are lost and forgotten. A specific absence. There is a particular moment in the archives that speaks to the mystery with peculiar force. In the year 1730, a scholar and cartographer named Philipp Johann Tabert von Strahlenberg was released from captivity after serving as a prisoner of war during conflicts between Russian and Swedish forces. During his imprisonment in Siberia, Strahlenberg had travelled extensively through Central Asia. Upon his release, he authored a work describing his experiences and observations. In his account, he discussed the peoples and lands of Central Asia with the kind of detail that could only come from direct observation. Yet when Strahlenberg discussed the peoples he had encountered in the region where maps placed Tartaria, he did not use the name Tartaria at all. He referred instead to specific peoples with specific names: Kalmyks, Kyrgyz, Kazakhs, and others. He described their territories, their ways of life, their interactions with Russian and other powers. He provided information that would have been useful to mapmakers seeking to create more accurate representations of the region. And yet, nowhere in his extensive writings does he confirm the existence of an organized empire called Tartaria. Instead, his account suggests a region inhabited by various peoples, each with their own political organization, their own territories, their own identities. Strahlenberg's account represents a pivotal moment in the history of Tartaria's disappearance. Here was a man who had travelled in the very region where Tartaria was supposed to exist. Here was a man with first-hand knowledge and the authority to speak about what he had seen. And his account, rather than confirming Tartaria, suggested instead that the region was more complex, more fragmented, more organised into multiple distinct peoples than the concept of a unified Tartaria would suggest. The absence of Tartaria from Strahlenberg's account is itself a kind of evidence. It suggests that by the early 18th century, a well-informed European scholar did not recognise or did not believe in the concept of Tartaria that mapmakers had been perpetuating. The change in how educated Europeans understood Central Asia was becoming clear. The old categories were being replaced. The mystery of Tartaria was becoming not a pressing question, but rather a curious historical artifact, a reminder of how geographers of an earlier age had organised their incomplete knowledge. The archives stay silent. If we visit the great archives of the world today, we can find records of Tartaria. We can find the maps that included it. We can find references in cartographic histories to the question of Tartaria's existence. We can find the scholarly articles and books that have attempted to solve the mystery. But when we search for documents from Tartaria itself, administrative records, historical chronicles, evidence of government, preserved letters or official correspondences, we find nothing. The archives stay silent. This silence is the true depth of the mystery. We have maps that say Tartaria was. We do not have documents from Tartaria that say anything at all. We have indirect evidence references on maps, mentions in cartographic history, but no direct evidence. We have the shadows of a civilization on maps, but none of the substance we would expect to find if that civilization had truly been organized and significant enough to merit such consistent cartographic representation. In a way, this silence is more eloquent than words. It tells a story. It tells us that something happened that resulted in Tartaria appearing on maps, despite lacking the kind of historical documentation that would normally accompany such an appearance. It tells us that there was a disconnect between how maps represented the world and how historical records documented it. It tells us that the process of creating maps, which involves inheriting and building upon previous cartographic work, can perpetuate representations even when the underlying reality is uncertain or absent. The archives preserve many things. They preserve the records of empires that have passed away. They preserve the writings of ancient scholars. They preserve the documents created by forgotten governments. But they do not preserve anything from Tartaria. And that preservation of absence, that recording of silence, is perhaps the most significant evidence we possess regarding the mystery of whether Tartaria was ever real at all. Names that changed, lands that shifted. As European knowledge of Central Asia improved, as the age of exploration advanced, and direct contact with the peoples of the region became more common, the map began to change. Place names that had seemed stable proved to be unstable. Territories that had seemed distinct proved to be composite. Political organizations that seemed unified proved to be fragmented. The process of mapping Central Asia became more complex, not simpler, as knowledge increased. The Caspian Sea, which had seemed a stable geographical anchor, came to be understood as a region with shifting populations around its shores. The territories north of it, where Tartaria had been placed, became recognized as the homeland of various peoples whose political affiliations changed over time. What had seemed like a single entity became understood as multiple entities in complex relationship with one another. The Tartars, whose name might have been transformed into Tartaria, proved to be not a unified people, but rather various groups. Some were sedentary, living in cities. Others were nomadic, moving with herds across the steppes. Some were political actors in their own right, ruling territories and engaging in diplomacy. Others were subject to various overlords. The Tatar identity was real, but it did not correspond to a single, unified territorial organization that could be accurately represented by a single name on a map. Similar complexity surrounded other peoples of the region. The Kyrgyz, the Kazakhs, the various Turkic groups, all of these were real peoples with real histories, but they were not organized under a single Tartarian umbrella. They had their own organizations, their own political systems, their own ways of relating to one another and to neighboring civilizations. As this complexity became apparent, the old categories broke down. Tartaria, which had served as a way of organizing European uncertainty about the region, became obsolete. More specific names took its place. The maps became more accurate, not because new territories were discovered, but because the territories that had always existed were better understood. The peoples were still there, the lands were still there, but they were no longer Tartaria. They were themselves. The modern search begins. By the 19th century, an interesting phenomenon began to emerge. Even as Tartaria had largely disappeared from official European maps and scholarly consensus, interest in it began to revive among certain scholars and historians. The question that had seemed settled Tartaria was simply a historical error. A product of earlier cartographers' limited knowledge began to be questioned again by new researchers approaching the problem with fresh perspectives. These 19th century scholars began to systematically collect maps that included Tartaria. They began to examine them comparatively, looking for patterns in how different cartographers had represented it. They began to ask new questions. Was there any consistency to where cartographers placed Tartaria? Could they identify a common source from which later cartographers were copying? Was there any evidence that Tartaria had been based on real reports or documentation that had since been lost? The work of these scholars created what might be called the modern Tartaria question. Rather than accepting the dismissal of Tartaria as a simple cartographic error, they approached it as a genuine historical puzzle. If so many capable cartographers had included Tartaria on their maps, surely there must have been some reason. If the consistency across maps was as striking as it seemed, surely that suggested something more than a simple copying error. What if Tartaria was real, but its history had been lost? What if the documentation had been destroyed or lost to time? What if there were rational explanations for why Tartaria appeared on maps, yet remained absent from historical records? These researchers operated without the internet, without modern databases, without many of the tools that contemporary scholars take for granted. They worked by visiting archives in person, by carefully examining individual maps, by building collections of evidence through patient accumulation. They published their findings in academic journals and books. They corresponded with one another across national boundaries, sharing their discoveries and debating their interpretations. The result was a resurrection of Tartaria, from the realm of settled historical questions to the realm of genuine mysteries. The question was no longer whether Tartaria existed, that seemed almost beside the point. The real question became, why had Tartaria appeared on maps? What processes had led to its appearance and subsequent disappearance? What did the phenomenon of Tartaria tell us about how historical knowledge is created and transmitted into the libraries? Imagine yourself as one of these 19th century scholars pursuing the Tartaria mystery with the tools available to your age. You cannot simply search a database. You must travel to libraries, sometimes across international boundaries, sometimes into remote archives that are difficult to access. You must examine maps one by one, taking notes, comparing their features, trying to construct a picture of what earlier cartographers knew and believed. You arrive at a library in Vienna. The librarians, once you have explained your scholarly purpose, grant you access to the map collection. You are shown to a reading room. On the table before you, they place several historic maps. You put on gloves, as instructed, to protect these fragile documents. You examine each one carefully, taking notes on the representation of Tartaria. What details does each cartographer include? How consistent is the placement across different maps? Are there annotations or notations that might suggest where the cartographer got the information? From Vienna, you journey to Amsterdam. The Great Library there holds a collection of maps from the Dutch Golden Age, when Amsterdam was the centre of mapmaking and cartographic innovation. You spend days examining maps created in this city, watching how different cartographers represented Tartaria. You notice that some maps include more detail than others. Some show rivers and settlements, others are more vague. You begin to wonder if you can trace the flow of information from map to map, if you can see how later cartographers incorporated elements from earlier works, while adding their own interpretations. Your search continues. London, Prague, Berlin, you move from city to city, following the thread of Tartaria through the archives of Europe. In each library, you discover new maps. In each archive, you uncover new information. Gradually, a picture emerges. It is not a complete picture. The mystery does not fully resolve. But your research suggests that Tartaria was not a simple error. Something lay behind its appearance on maps. Some reports, some information, some knowledge had existed that led mapmakers to include it. What that knowledge was, where it had come from, whether it corresponded to anything real, these questions remain open. But your work has restored Tartaria to the status of a genuine mystery, something worthy of serious scholarly attention. What the new maps revealed, the 20th century brought new tools to the study of Tartaria. Cartographic analysis became more sophisticated. Historians applied new methodologies to examining how information had flowed between mapmakers. Scholars began to use comparative analysis to track which maps had influenced which other maps. The invention of photography allowed researchers to preserve copies of rare maps for study. Later, computers allowed for storage and analysis of vast amounts of information about historical maps. What these new tools revealed was both complex and revealing. Researchers traced specific maps and established chains of influence, showing that particular cartographic features appeared on map A, then on map B, then on map C, suggesting that the later cartographers were copying from earlier ones. In some cases, they could identify the source from which information had flowed. In other cases, the chains of influence became lost in the mists of time, suggesting that information had come from sources now entirely disappeared. The analysis revealed something else, as well. It showed that the representation of Tartaria varied across maps in ways that suggested real geographic misunderstanding rather than simple copying. Different cartographers placed Tartaria in different locations. Different maps gave it different extents. Some represented it as a major political entity, while others relegated it to a relatively minor status. This variation suggested that cartographers were not simply copying a standard representation, but rather interpreting information in different ways, adding their own understandings, making their own geographic judgments. This variation, paradoxically, both supported and undermined various theories about Tartaria. On one hand, it suggested that multiple cartographers had drawn on their own sources, indicating that information about Tartaria had been circulating among map-making communities. On the other hand, the lack of consistency suggested that no single, reliable body of knowledge about Tartaria existed. Had Tartaria been a well-known, well-documented entity, we would expect greater consistency in how it was represented across different maps. The fact that representations varied suggested that cartographers were working with fragmentary, unclear information. The theories persist. By the late 20th century, the Tartaria question had become embedded in scholarly literature, in popular fascination with historical mysteries, and in the broader culture's sense that the world contained puzzles that did not have simple answers. Academic articles continue to be published, proposing new theories. Popular writers incorporated Tartaria into broader narratives about lost civilizations and hidden histories. The mystery had become self-perpetuating, a source of fascination that generated its own scholarship and interest. Some scholars proposed that Tartaria might be connected to specific historical peoples or territories. Perhaps it was a reference to the territory of the Tartars during a specific historical period. Perhaps it corresponded to one of the khanates that ruled Central Asia. Perhaps it was an attempt by mapmakers to represent the vast territory under Mongol control. Perhaps it was related to the early expansion of the Russian Empire. Each theory had its proponents. Each offered an explanation that accounted for some of the evidence, while leaving other aspects of the mystery unresolved. Other scholars began to approach Tartaria not as a historical problem to be solved, but as a cultural phenomenon to be understood. In this view, the question of whether Tartaria actually existed became less important than understanding what Tartaria meant, what psychological and cultural needs it filled, why it fascinated people, what it represented about how Europeans understood and organized their knowledge of distant lands. Tartaria became a window into the European imagination, a way of studying how uncertainty is managed in systems of knowledge creation. Still, other researchers investigated the possibility that documents or records about Tartaria had once existed but been lost. They examined the history of archives and libraries, considering what information might have been destroyed during wars, revolutions, and other historical disruptions. They speculated about the possibilities that records held in Central Asian cities might have been destroyed during invasions or political upheavals. They pursued the notion that Tartaria had been real, but evidence of its existence had been largely erased from the historical record through the accidents and catastrophes of history. The theories persisted because the mystery resisted definitive resolution. No smoking gun emerged. No conclusive evidence proved that Tartaria had existed. No conclusive evidence proved that it had not. The situation remained fundamentally ambiguous, and it was this ambiguity that kept scholars engaged, that kept the questions alive, that sustained interest in Tartaria across centuries. The shadow that wouldn't fade. What is remarkable about Tartaria is not that it was forgotten. Many things are forgotten by history. What is remarkable is that Tartaria, once forgotten, was remembered again. In our contemporary moment, when Tartaria has been absent from mainstream maps and scholarly consensus for nearly 2 centuries, it remains an object of fascination. Books continue to be written about it. Articles appear in academic journals. Internet forums buzz with theories and speculation. Tartaria has become, in many ways, more culturally present in our modern age than it was even during the centuries when it actually appeared on maps. This persistence is curious. It suggests that Tartaria represents something more than a historical question. It is not merely a puzzle to be solved, not simply a mystery waiting for a definitive answer that will settle the matter once and for all. Instead, Tartaria seems to satisfy something in the human imagination. It speaks to a desire for hidden histories, for knowledge that has been suppressed or forgotten, for mysteries that resist easy explanation. In a world where information seems ever more transparent, where everything appears to be documented and catalogued and digitized, Tartaria represents the possibility that vast territories of knowledge remain unknown, that empires might have existed beyond our historical ken, that the world is stranger and more mysterious than our current understanding suggests. There is something deeply satisfying about a mystery that cannot be solved. It invites speculation, it permits imagination, it allows each person who engages with it to construct their own version of what Tartaria might have been. The scholar finds in Tartaria a puzzle to apply her analytical skills to. The romantic finds in Tartaria a lost empire waiting to be discovered. The skeptic finds in Tartaria an example of how error perpetuates through systems of knowledge. The mystic finds in Tartaria a hidden chapter of world history, perhaps deliberately concealed. Each of these interpretations can point to some aspect of the Tartaria phenomenon that seems to support their view. This multiplicity of interpretations is part of what keeps Tartaria alive. Unlike a mystery that is solved, which then becomes settled history, no longer mysterious, Tartaria remains perpetually available for new interpretation. Each generation of scholars can approach it fresh, can apply new methodologies, can ask new questions. Each generation can find in Tartaria what it is looking for. The shadow that Tartaria casts across history refuses to fade, because the light that illuminates it continues to shift and change. Echoes in culture and memory. Beyond the realm of scholarly study, Tartaria has found its way into culture. It appears in fiction, it appears in alternative history narratives. It appears in the speculative and esoteric traditions that attempt to reconstruct hidden histories or reveal suppressed knowledge. It appears in fantasy worlds created by authors who draw on the aura of mystery that surrounds it. In all of these contexts, Tartaria functions not as a historical fact to be verified, but as a symbol, a marker of something lost, something inaccessible, something that might have been real but remains forever, just beyond the reach of certainty. In Russian culture, particularly, Tartaria has taken on a special significance. Some Russian scholars and enthusiasts have proposed that Tartaria represented a golden age of Russian or Proto-Russian civilization, a time before the Mongol invasions, when a great civilization flourished in the steppes. In this interpretation, Tartaria becomes connected to Russian identity, to questions of national origin and historical pride. Whether this interpretation has scholarly support matters less than the fact that it resonates emotionally, that it speaks to cultural anxieties and questions about identity and national history. For some in Russia, Tartaria represents a history that might have been a path not taken, a civilization that was lost or suppressed, but whose memory persists. In Western popular culture, Tartaria has taken on different resonances. It appears in steampunk fiction, where alternative technological developments in a version of Tartaria might have changed world history. It appears in fantasy worlds, where Tartaria becomes a fully realized fictional civilization with its own magic systems, its own cosmologies, its own histories. It appears in conspiracy theories, where Tartaria is sometimes portrayed as a hidden civilization deliberately removed from maps and historical records by powers that wish to suppress knowledge of it. In these various contexts, Tartaria becomes a kind of Rorschach test. People see in it what they are looking for, what they need, what they desire. The phenomenon of Tartaria in contemporary culture reveals something important about how modern minds engage with history. We no longer believe in a fixed, unchanging past. We understand that history is interpreted, that different perspectives produce different narratives, that what we know about the past is always filtered through the frameworks we use to understand it. In this context, Tartaria, a place that exists on maps but not in records, that is real in representation but uncertain in fact, becomes a perfect emblem. It represents the gap between what we think we know and what we can verify. It represents the possibility that the historical record is incomplete, that there are blank spaces in our knowledge, that mysteries persist at the heart of what we thought was settled. The cultural persistence of Tartaria is perhaps more significant than its historical reality. Whether Tartaria was real or not, the fact that it has continued to fascinate people across centuries suggests that it meets a genuine need. It provides a focus for our sense of historical mystery. It gives us a name to attach to our awareness that the past contains unknowns. It allows us to explore, through Tartaria, questions about how we know what we know, about the reliability of our historical records, about what might be hidden in the gaps of our understanding. The question remains. After centuries of speculation, after generations of scholars applying increasingly sophisticated methodologies, after the accumulation of vast amounts of information about maps and cartographic history and the peoples of Central Asia, the fundamental question about Tartaria remains unanswered. Did it exist? The evidence does not provide a definitive answer. The maps suggest it was believed to exist by multiple cartographers working across different times and places. The historical records suggest it was either not documented or is no longer documented. The archaeological evidence remains ambiguous, capable of being interpreted in multiple ways. Perhaps this is as it should be. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to persist. Perhaps the value of Tartaria lies not in solving the mystery, but in contemplating it, in allowing it to expand our sense of what the past might contain, in reminding us that history is not a settled thing, but an ongoing conversation between present and past, between what we know and what we seek to know. The question of Tartaria's existence has led us through 3 centuries of European cartography. It has led us through the history of Central Asian peoples and empires. It has led us through the development of geographical knowledge and the process by which maps become more accurate over time. It has led us through debates about how information travels, about how error perpetuates, about how representations can become embedded in our understanding of the world. Along the way, we have learned something not just about Tartaria, but about history itself, about how it is made, how it is transmitted, how it persists even in its absence. The question of Tartaria remains because it touches on something fundamental about human knowledge. We live in a world of incomplete information. We make maps of territories we have never fully explored. We create categories to organize what we do not fully understand. We build on the work of those who came before us, and sometimes we inherit their errors along with their insights. Tartaria is, in many ways, a perfect symbol for this condition. It represents the gap between what we claim to know and what we can verify. It represents the possibility that the past contains mysteries we may never fully resolve. Yet perhaps the persistence of the question is not a failure, but a success. Perhaps it is better to acknowledge that some historical questions may not have definitive answers than to settle prematurely on an explanation that seems satisfying but that is not fully supported by evidence. Perhaps it is better to live with mystery, to sit with uncertainty, to allow the question to remain open, than to foreclose possibility by insisting on a final answer that would bring closure but not truth. You stand between past and mystery. Imagine yourself in a moment of reflection, standing between the world of maps and the world of historical records. You have travelled through centuries of cartographic representation. You have examined the evidence. You have considered the theories. You have walked, at least in imagination, through the cities that might have existed, the territories that might have been organised, the civilization that might have flourished. And now, at the end of this journey, you stand in a space of not knowing. Before you, as if laid out on a table, is all the evidence you have gathered. The maps, with their repeated representation of Tartaria, the historical records, with their silence, the theories, each offering a possible explanation, the debates, each scholar making a case for their interpretation. You look at all of this, and you feel the weight of accumulated knowledge that does not quite add up to certainty. Behind you is the vast past, stretching back through centuries, through millennia. Somewhere in that past, Tartaria either existed or did not. Somewhere, in that vast terrain of what has been, there are answers to the questions you have been asking. But that terrain is obscured. The paths leading to certainty are blocked or uncertain. You cannot walk back into history and verify what happened. You can only stand where you stand in the present moment, looking backward at traces and shadows and fragmentary evidence. And yet, standing here, at this boundary between knowing and not knowing, there is something peaceful about the condition. The mystery does not have to be solved. The question does not have to be answered. You can simply hold it, can sit with it, can allow it to expand your sense of what the past might contain. Tartaria, whether real or not, has done its work. It has led you on a journey through history. It has shown you how maps are made, how knowledge is transmitted, how errors perpetuate and truths emerge. It has reminded you that the world is stranger than it sometimes seems, that there are gaps in what we know, that history is not a settled thing, but an ongoing conversation. You feel, in this moment, a kind of release. The need to know, the drive to solve, the insistence on certainty, all of these can be laid down. In their place comes something gentler, a willingness to wonder, an acceptance of mystery, a recognition that some questions may be more valuable unanswered than answered. Tartaria becomes, in this moment, not a problem to be solved, but a companion in uncertainty. It becomes a reminder that it is all right to live with questions, that mystery is not a failure, but a feature of how we encounter the world, that the unknown is not something to be feared, but something to be contemplated. The light around you softens, the boundaries between past and present grow less distinct. The maps blur slightly, becoming less representations of fixed territories and more like dreamscapes, like the landscape of imagination itself. Tartaria, whether real or phantom, seems to smile across the centuries. It has kept its secret. It will keep keeping it. And in that keeping, it offers something precious. The reminder that the world is still capable of surprising us, that history still holds mysteries, that there are limits to what we know, and there is value in acknowledging those limits. The shadow that persists. As this long journey through time and speculation draws toward its conclusion, we can reflect on what Tartaria has been, not as a place, but as a phenomenon. Tartaria is the name we give to the gap between maps and records, between representation and documentation, between what European cartographers believed about the world and what historical sources could verify. Tartaria is the embodiment of uncertainty itself, made concrete and geographic. And yet Tartaria persists. Century after century, long after it has disappeared from official maps, long after scholarly consensus has moved on to other questions, Tartaria continues to fascinate. New books are written about it. New theories are proposed. New people discover the mystery and find themselves drawn into speculation about what Tartaria might have been. The mystery perpetuates itself, generation after generation, drawing people toward it like a light in darkness. Perhaps this is because Tartaria speaks to something fundamental in human nature. We are creatures who seek pattern, who try to organize chaos into meaning, who build maps of territories we do not fully understand. Tartaria is a reminder of our limitations, of the gap between what we think we know and what we can verify, of the possibility that the world contains mysteries we may never fully penetrate. In a modern age where information seems ever more transparent, where everything appears documentable and recordable and digitizable, Tartaria represents the possibility that vast territories of knowledge remain hidden, that the past guards its secrets, that mystery persists at the heart of what we know. The shadow of Tartaria stretches across centuries. It falls on maps made in Vienna and Amsterdam, in London and Berlin. It falls on the scholarly articles and books that attempt to explain what Tartaria was. It falls on the contemporary culture that continues to reference and speculate about it. It falls, perhaps, on each of us who pause to contemplate this historical enigma and wonder about what might have been, what might still be hidden, what mysteries the world contains. This shadow is not something to fear. It is something to honor, to sit with, to allow to expand our understanding of what history is and how it works. Tartaria, real or phantom, has taught us something valuable about how civilizations can be remembered and forgotten, about how knowledge travels and transforms, about the gap between what we map and what we understand. In doing so, it has become more than a historical question. It has become a way of thinking about history itself, about the nature of evidence and interpretation, about the mysterious nature of the past. The shadow persists. It will continue to persist, and that persistence is perhaps the most important thing Tartaria has to teach us. We have travelled far on this long journey backward through time and forward again into the present. We have explored the maps that included Tartaria with such consistency. We have examined the historical records that did not mention it. We have considered the competing theories about what Tartaria might have been, where it might have been located, why it appeared on maps, and then disappeared from them. We have walked, in imagination, through cities that might or might not have existed, spoken to cartographers long since dead, contemplated the mystery that has fascinated scholars for generations. What we have learned is not perhaps a definitive answer to the question of whether Tartaria was real. What we have learned, instead, is something about how history is made, about how information travels and transforms, about the gap between what we represent and what we can verify. We have learned that empires can be remembered by maps, even when they are forgotten by records. We have learned that the absence of documentation is not the same as the absence of existence, yet neither is it proof of existence. We have learned to sit with mystery, to accept that some questions may not have definitive answers, and to find value in the questioning itself. Tartaria stands, in the end, as a symbol of something larger than itself. It stands as a reminder that the world is stranger than it seems, that the past holds secrets we may never fully penetrate, that history is not a fixed and settled thing, but an ongoing conversation between what we know and what we seek to know. In this role, Tartaria has become more valuable than any definitive answer could make it. The mystery is richer than any solution could be. It's been a pleasure to guide you through these serene moments in history. I hope these ancient narratives have helped ease your mind towards sleep. May the gentle currents of time carry you to peaceful rest.